The main hope of a nation lies in the proper education of its youth. These words, spoken by the Dutch theologian Erasmus in the 15th century, are as true today as they were back then. Now, in the United Kingdom, we are introducing in September 2020 new regulations which require all schools, whether independent, maintained, Christian or otherwise, new teaching requirements which will include relationships education for primary school, relationships and sex education for secondary school, and health education for all schools.
The biggest shake-up in sex education for almost 2 decades has been announced.
Children will learn about gay and trans relationships in schools from the age of 5.
The guidance says schools can decide what is appropriate to teach and when, but LGBT people should be respected in British society and their relationships protected by law.
To be giving our children information, to be sexualising our children too young is not good.
What is sex education like? Who is teaching it and what are they teaching in school?
Children and young people today are growing up in an increasingly complex world and living their lives seamlessly online and off. For relationships education and RSE, the aim is to put in place the building blocks needed for positive and safe relationships of all kinds, starting with the family and friends and moving out to other kinds of relationships, including those online.
I think a lot of parents are concerned about RSE and relationship education because there's a lot that we don't know. Schools even and local authorities don't know what is going to be taught as part of this. So there's a lot of guessing as to what this will be and what it'll mean.
This has already been hugely controversial. Many parents saying, why on earth would you want to give this kind of advice to kids of 5 years old?
The Department of Education has been very vocal in insisting that LGBT elements now form part of the teaching that all of our schools in the United Kingdom, regardless of religious character, must teach. They've done so under numerous banners: inclusivity, modern British values, anti-bullying, and tolerance, just to name a few. So the million-dollar question is, what does relationships education and RSE actually entail? Section 34 of the Children and Social Welfare Act amends the Education Acts of 1996 and 2002, as well as the independent school regulations. It makes mandatory the teaching of 4 different elements, and it's important that you as parents know what these elements are. The first, safety in forming and maintaining relationships. The second, the characteristics of healthy relationships. Third, how relationships may affect physical and mental health and well-being. And finally, pupils should be taught about the nature of marriage and civil partnership and their importance for family life and the bringing up of children. So these are the 4 elements that children must learn about. These are the statutory requirements. Now, on top of that, the government has said that in the manner that this is taught, that the material must be age appropriate and that the school must have due regard for the religious background of their pupils. So when we look specifically to these 4 elements, the one that stands out from above all of these as far as a morality perspective is the obligation to teach about the nature of marriage, which the statutory guidance suggests includes talking about same-sex marriage and different family models. So that would mean talking about single parents, same-sex parents, and mother-father parenting. So one of the issues about this is the manner in which it will be taught. So importantly, schools must have, and this is a statutory requirement, schools must have a written policy in place as to how they plan to teach this material to children. So as part of that, the complementary statutory requirement is that when they're developing this policy, the school must consult with you, the parent, in what will go in the policy and what will stay out of the policy. And that's part of having regard for the age and the religious background of the pupils. So not only are they required to consult you and to provide you a written copy of this policy, but they are required to show you examples of what is being taught. And this is important because what we have in schools increasingly is a level of ideological education that is wholly inappropriate, in my opinion, for very young children or children at all of any age to be viewing. So examples would be Heather has two mommies. We have Daddy's roommate, and Daddy's roommate is particularly egregious in my opinion. It's got, a middle-aged man with a much younger boyfriend. They show them shaving in the bathroom. They show them on the beach putting oil on each other's backs. And the educational value of this, to me, is nil. What it teaches kids is about behavior and not mutual respect, and therefore it misses the mark entirely. We have My Princess Boy, which has been at the center of a storm because it's part of the No Outsiders program that's being challenged and protested so heavily in Birmingham. And this teaches that it's okay for a very young child to choose whatever gender they wish. My problem with this, beyond the parental rights issue, is that there's a health issue here. Now, in 2009, which isn't that long ago, that was the year before we introduced the Equality Act into schools, which then led to gender identity being taught in a number of schools. We had 97 kids, just 97 kids referred to gender identity clinics. That number has skyrocketed. So there's clearly a correlation, and there's clearly a contagion to this type of material in our schools being taught very young kids, and kids being referred to gender identity clinics. So we have what to me amounts to a mental health crisis that is national in nature. Now, the issue that I have with the guidance is that it makes a distinction, and it's done in the introduction, and they follow throughout the entire guidance with this distinction. They say that the guidance tells schools what they should teach and what they must teach. Now, that sounds like a minor distinction, but it's actually a very significant distinction, because what they must teach are these four elements that I've been talking about, which are the characteristics of a healthy relationship, safety in forming relationships, etc. So when they talk about what schools should be teaching, the guidance goes into any number of other subjects like abortion, gender identity, things that are not found strictly in the statutory requirements. And so they are what we call in legal terms ultra vires, meaning that they go beyond the authority given to them by Parliament in setting out what schools should teach. So what's dangerous about it, particularly in my estimation, is one of the things they say is that LGBT elements must be taught, not as a standalone class, but it should be weaved into the fabric of the curriculum, meaning it should be taught as part of English, math, or any of the other major subjects. And what that does is it makes it impossible for parents to opt their kids out of learning about this stuff, because it becomes a major part of the fabric of the national curriculum. And that creates a major challenge to parental rights, because now you have a very pervasive issue, something that's being woven into the curriculum on a day-by-day basis. There's moral signaling attached to it. There's an affirmation of the lifestyle attached to it that makes it impossible for parents with a contrary view, or at least very difficult, to raise their kids in accordance with their own moral position on this issue, and that is legally wrong. When we look to what the other statutory obligations schools owe parents, and the Department of Education owes parents, we look to Section 9 of the Education Act 1996, which says that parents are the primary educators of children, and schools should listen to parents as to how they want their kids to be educated. We look at the Human Rights Act, which is very clear that the state, and by extension schools, must respect the manner in which parents wish to raise their kids in accordance with their religious or philosophical views, including their Christian views about parenting. So let's be clear. When the guidance says what schools should be teaching and what they must be teaching are these four elements that we've been talking about. What they should be teaching are just recommendations. Schools don't have to follow them. They should have due regard to what is in them. And what due regard says, and a lot of local authorities, a lot of governors get this wrong. They think due regard means you must follow it. What due regard means is you have to factor the guidance into any curriculum decision you're making. And you have to balance it against competing factors, factors which include parental rights, which include safeguarding, which include the ethos and religious character of a school. So all of those factors play a part, and in some cases, if there's weighty reasons, trump the guidance. So a faith school, for example, and the guidance speaks to this as well, a faith school has every right to maintain its Christian character or whatever its religious character is, so that they could teach this material in a way that is friendly to their doctrine. So for example, as part of sex education, they can focus on abstinence only as the best way of preventing teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections. They can say that sex is properly placed within marriage. They can speak to the doctrinal positions of their church when teaching this material. The statutory element is that they must teach about the nature of marriage, so that they have to talk about the existence of same-sex marriage and other family models. Now, what they don't have to do is affirm that in any way or celebrate it. What they can do, because of their religious character, is talk about the Christian definition of marriage and why mother-father parenting is important. Now, they can't do that in a way that's derogatory to other forms of family, but they don't have to say that all forms of family or all forms of behavior are equal. So a Christian school can maintain its Christian ethos in teaching this material, and the guidance is clear about that. Another example would be what schools should teach. They talk about abstinence. Now, abstinence would hypothetically be a very important part of the sex education curriculum. We want to be teaching kids that the proper place for sex is within a marital situation. So faith schools are allowed to do that. So that is important for Christian schools to recall. Now, when we move this discussion to what a maintained school would do, one without a religious character, the situation is a little bit different, because part of this guidance is that individual schools are allowed to create its own content. And that's where it's important to remember that they must consult you beforehand when drafting their policy. Because a school can, in fact, teach this material in a way very similar to a Christian school. They have that right. But they also have a right to go the other way on this and promote LGBT elements. So what you need to know as a parent is this key line in the statute, that this material must be age appropriate and they must have due regard for the religious background of the pupils and their parents. So if this material, if these books are being introduced in your child's school, you should know about it before the policy is in place, and you should object to it at that point. And if this material makes its way into the classroom after the policy is in place, you have grounds for an objection, both to their governors and to the Secretary of State for Education. Now, one of the most contentious issues about the new regulations is the issue of parental withdrawal or opt-outs. So, as I've said, we've got differentiated education. We have at primary level relationships education, which should bring in no elements of sex education. It should be teaching about healthy friendships, well-being, brushing your teeth, flossing, things like that. That's all in the guidance. The second part for secondary schools, there is relationships and sex education. Now, the guidance seems to bifurcate those, meaning that there's a separation between relationships education and sex education. So in any case, whether it's primary school or secondary school, there is no right of withdrawal for relationships education. When it comes to sex education, however, there is still a right of parental withdrawal upon the request of the parents. Now, what's at issue here is that the nature of that request has changed. It used to be almost an absolute right of withdrawal once you make it. Now it's more difficult because individual head teachers, if they so choose, can reject a request for withdrawal under certain, what the statute calls exceptional circumstances. Now, the problem with that is the statute doesn't define what exceptional circumstances are, and that means that head teachers almost have an unfettered discretion to reject an opt-out request. So what we're seeing in schools across the country, and you can see it through Christian Concern's different cases like Heaver's Farm, where you have very ideological head teachers really pushing the LGBT agenda, that it's very likely that a parent who requests an opt-out from sex education will be rejected that opt-out. And that's a problem, because the European Court 42 years ago had said that there is no distinction among subjects, whether it's English, math, sex education, religious education. If any form of indoctrination is occurring, you have a right to opt out. So this is very important. I think that the government's position on opt-outs isn't sustainable under the current law. It would be very simple also for teachers to move stuff that rightly belongs in sex education and put it as part of relationships education, and then tell parents, well, this is now relationships education, you don't have a right of withdrawal. And that just legally fails. So if you find yourself in a position where this is happening, please contact us. Go to www.christianconcern.com and let us know so that we can act in support of you and your parental rights. So at the end of the day, there is a legal standard set. It's not talked about a lot and it's not mentioned in the guidance, but the legal standard set is that there's a prohibition on indoctrination of children. So the line between teaching respect for other people based on a protected characteristic, so respecting someone who identifies as LGBT, for example, there is a fine line between teaching respect and affirming a lifestyle. So equality, ultimately, is that we are all created in God's image. We share a common humanity, and based on that, we're all equal. Equality doesn't mean that all behaviors are equal. It doesn't mean that all lifestyle choices are equal. So this material becomes very difficult on a practical level for teachers to present to students. So the standard is that this material, if it lacks objectivity, if it's not critical, and if it's not pluralistic, then that means it's indoctrinating and it shouldn't be in our schools, and you can raise a complaint about this material. Looking at some of these books, looking at My Princess Boy, Daddy's Roommate, I would say that not only does this have no educational value, it is not critical and it's not objective, and it breaches your parental rights, and it can be challenged. So this does create a situation where Ofsted is saying that this material is okay, but the law really on it suggests otherwise. And so this stuff will be worked out in the courts over time, but be aware as parents you do have a right to object. And my suggestion is at the outset, when these policies are being developed next year, be very active in ensuring that this material is not part of your child's education, and that when they bring up any of this material, that it not be so pervasive in the curriculum that it offends your parental rights and the ability of you to raise your child in accordance with your Christian faith.